Pricing in the cloud is not as straightforward as we have in our on-premises environment. There could be many different factors actually that can affect the cost in the cloud. So what are those factors? On how this is different from on-premises, this is what we are going to discuss in this lesson. So far we know that in our traditional on-premises data center, we have upfront hardware cost. We have to think about the building, electricity, cooling, internet, employees, software, application, licenses, and so on. But the point I'm trying to say here is all of that have a fixed cost. If you calculate this, you may come up with, for example, $250,000 per month, for example, right? Now, this is fixed. Once you calculate this, no matter how many applications you are going to use, how long you are going to use, how much data you are going to save, your cost is not going to vary. But in case of cloud, this is not as straightforward. This is not as simple. It depends on how much you are using your service. And actually it depends on many different parameters. So for example, let's take example of storage service. Now forget about what is storage service. We are going to discuss this in detail. You can just think of storage service which can store something, for example, your images, your videos. You can store these things in your storage service. Now the point I'm trying to convey here is that if you want to calculate the cost for storage service, it's not very straightforward. You have to think about how much data you are going to store and you have to pay per month. You have to think about what kind of operations you are going to have, how many read operations, how many write operations, and during these operations, how much data actually you are transferring, how much or how many backups you have for your data. So after calculating all this, you can get your per month cost. And of course, all these things can vary every month. Similarly, let's take another example of virtual machine here. Now, if you want to calculate the price for virtual machine, you have to calculate that how long your virtual machine is running, for how long you are reserving your public IP address. Once again, how much data is coming in or coming out, or how much disk size or amount of disk read and write operations you are going to have. So it's not straightforward. Basically, it depends on many different factors, many different parameters here. So let's talk about some of the major pricing model we have in Azure. So for example, we have the free tier. That means there are some services provided by Azure which are always free, no matter how much you use it. So for example, you have virtual network. You can create virtual network. You can create as many virtual networks as you want, and it is always going to be free. You can use Azure policy, so you can create rules around your different Azure resources, and it is always free. You can create and manage users using Azure Active Directory, and this is free. I mean, it has a premium version which is paid, but in general, Azure Active Directory is free. Similarly, you have Migrate service, you have Lighthouse, Catalog, and so on. Don't think about what are these services. We'll discuss whatever required in this course in upcoming lessons. But the point here I'm trying to convey is that there are services which are always free. Okay, you don't have to pay for it. Now there are some services where you pay for the time, how long you use that service. So for example, virtual machine, how long you use. Maybe you use for 10 minutes. Okay, you just have to pay for 10 minutes. And basically they calculate the price of this virtual machine based on per second, I believe, right? So every second you use this virtual machine, you just have to pay for it, right? You have the app services, you have SQL Server, you have load balancer. So depend on how long you use it, time, you use this particular service, and you just pay for it. That's it. Now there are some services which depend on how much data you are actually storing there, and most of these are storage service and database service, of course. And there's some network traffic also, that how much data actually is moving between different networks. So you have network 1, you have network 2, and this may be in region 1, this may be in region 2. So this may be, for example, in USA, this may be, for example, in India. So how much data you are moving from this region into this region, you have to pay for that. How much data you are storing in storage service, how much data you're storing in database service, you have to pay for that. So these services, these are some examples. There can be more services, but the point here is there are services which cost you based on the data, right, on the GB. Similarly, there are some services which based on the number of operations you do. So for example, you have Cosmos DB. So for example, if you have, let's say, 50,000 operations, in your Cosmos DB. So you pay for that. These many read operations, write operations you have, you just pay for that. Similarly, for the storage service, depends on how many read and write and delete operations you have, you pay for that. So charges based on number of operation. Then you have number of execution, and this is mostly valid for serverless offering. And we'll discuss what is serverless later, but the point here is that in serverless offerings, you don't have to pay for infrastructure. You don't have to pay, for example, if you have your website, let's say, right, it's up and running, and if someone doesn't use that website, you don't have to pay for that. Depends on how many clicks you have, or how many, for example, in case of Azure Functions, how many times you use this Azure function. And by the way, Azure provide 1 million executions per month free. All right, so 1 million free every month. But if you use over that, if you use more than that, you have to pay for it. But the point here is that depends on number of executions. Serverless database, how many times you hit your database, logic apps. So depends on how many times you use, you pay. If you don't use, you just don't pay it, right? And then there are some other matrices also possible. So for example, Azure Active Directory is free, but Azure Active Directory also has a premium tier. In a premium tier, you create licenses and you assign these licenses to the different users. So depend on how many licenses you are using, you have to pay for that. There'll be charge based on the number of licenses. So this is different parameter or different metrics in one sense. And not just that, actually there are different parameters, there can be different factors which can affect your cost. So for example, region or location, not all regions have the same cost. So for example, if Azure has, for example, data center in India, they may have a low cost because of the low infrastructure cost Azure has in India compared to, for example, USA. So if you create a virtual machine in India, that might be cheaper than you create in the USA. Right? So it depends on which location you are creating your resources. Now, how you are buying these resources, you are directly purchasing this over the internet. Maybe you have some kind of enterprise agreement. So if you have a big company, they use all these resources in a bulk. So Microsoft give them special discount, they have a special kind of agreement with them, right? So they get good discount, or they may be using the third-party cloud solution provider. Now we'll discuss later what is cloud solution provider, but the point I'm trying to convey here is that it depends on how you are purchasing these services, and you can pay based on that. And some services also provide the support option. So are you buying that? If you're buying that, you have to pay for that. If Microsoft has some kind of special offers or some programs going on, you may get some kind of discount there. So your price maybe depend on that. Similarly, there can be other factors also. But again, the point of this lesson is that in the cloud, the cost, the price, your bill, your charges are not as easy, as straightforward as you have in your on-premises environment. In on-premises environment, you can calculate it so easily. In the cloud, it depends on so many different factors and parameters, and it can vary every month depending on how much you're using your service. Let me take you to this page from Microsoft here. And if you see here, Microsoft told you that if you are using your free account, what are the different services you can use. And if you scroll down below, you can see Azure services that are always free, free always. And you can see that for Cosmos DB, 1000 requests are always free. If you're using Azure Kubernetes service, actually it's always free, right? And there can be more service. Azure Service Fabric, it's always free, right? And Azure Data Factory, 5 low frequency activities are free. You have to pay, if you use more than that. Azure Batch is always free. So you can look at all these services and see that how they're pricing. And actually also Microsoft has this page, Azure pricing. And if I scroll down below here, you can choose any of these services. So for example, if you're going to compute all these services, these are categories we have. And here we have different services, and you can click on any service and you can see that how this service actually cost you, what are different parameters you have in this particular service, which can make a difference in your pricing. And Microsoft also have something called pricing calculator, TCO calculator. Using these calculators also, you can figure out that how much it can cost you depend on the kind of workload you are going to run on this service. Now we have a complete separate section called cost management, in which we are going to discuss most of these things in even more greater detail. But in this lesson, I just wanted to give you a heads up, the point that how we generally calculate the cost in the cloud and how this is different from your on-premises environment. I hope that point is clear. I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you so much.